Hey, it's episode 7 of E9 Podcast, hosted by Stephen Jones, that's me, and my friend Seth Harshman. In this show, we listen to the stories of people who aren't necessarily like us, and with the help of Enneagram language, we try to connect with the common humanity that lies beneath all of our differences. It's a growing experience for us, and these stories are so good, we hope you might grow from them too. Today's guest is Lindsay Roan, which I'm getting used to saying because her last name is no longer Flick. She's a licensed local pastor in the United Methodist Church and currently serves as a hospice chaplain. She's an advocate, a servant, soon-to-be mom, and she challenges me in all the ways that I need. You'll hear her thoughts on perfectionism, LGBTQ matters, and sacrificing for the sake of a community that isn't sure they want you. We still manage to laugh a lot. You won't want to miss this.
No one on the planet is surprised.
Yeah.
My husband, I said, I took this, and he goes, oh, are you a 1? Yes.
Lindsay, welcome to the E9 podcast.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Before we get started, this is the first time that you and I have ever talked. You're a friend of Steve's, and you guys know each other, but I've never heard your voice until just a few minutes ago. So would you mind giving us just a general introduction to who you are, what you do?
So obviously my name is Lindsay. I live in Maine, and Stephen and I actually know each other from seminary. So my undergraduate degree is in social work, and my graduate degree is in divinity. So Stephen and I had that in common at school, so we could kind of speak the same social worker lingo, which is, I think, how we kind of connected. And we both worked a lot with similar populations, and I think have similar ways of how we hold our values in the world, but we express them very differently. And so we had a lot of good conversations about, how do we see ourselves moving through the world, and how does that play out in our lives? So we've sort of just stayed connected ever since seminary. Currently, I am a licensed local pastor in the United Methodist Church. I served in churches as both an associate pastor and then as a lead pastor for a while. Kind of found that institutional church can be a lot of maintaining buildings and additional functions, and I'm really interested in human relationship. Found myself leaning more into chaplaincy, and I currently work in an inpatient facility as a hospice chaplain.
Wow.
Her experience as a hospice chaplain is one of the many reasons why I wanted to see if she would be a guest on our show. Partly because it's an unusual experience, and it's a heavy experience. And Lindsay has a gift for that kind of work that is pretty rare, I think. And there are so many stories that she's had to share from it. So I didn't know how many of those would dovetail with what we're doing, but at the very least, she'll bring an interesting perspective to things.
My understanding is you've recently taken an online assessment for the Enneagram, and it has revealed to you, to no surprise to you, to those around you, to anyone, that you are 1. So what does being an Enneagram 1 mean to you?
Being, I think, in the social service field and also in ministry, I've done about 45,000 various tests about personality and traits, things like that. So I think that there are common threads in all of those tests. So I wasn't particularly shocked when I officially took it and found out, oh, yep, I'm exactly where I thought I might end up. But I think for me, it highlighted, probably because I am a 1, areas I really struggle, and some of the ways I get in my own way. That whole kind of perfectionist striving to always improve everything and being really hard on myself, very critical of myself, is definitely an area I am constantly running into. I really am extremely hard on myself. To me, it was sort of yep, this really is something that's deeply ingrained in me, is very much something that's true about me. So I found myself reading kind of the descriptors and the areas where, people need to work on things, and laughing because it's very much a reflection of probably a similar list I have about areas I need to improve in my life, which I guess makes sense.
I'm curious if you don't mind speaking into it, like what are the particular areas where you find yourself being really hard on yourself and that inner critic really shows up most prominently?
I think that I notice it a lot in my kind of lack of balance. I'm very much, if something is important to me or I value it, one of the reasons that I love my current position at the hospice and need it is because it's an inpatient facility. I literally can't take my work home with me. And I am somebody who would take my work home with me and work for hours and hours beyond when I was being paid, just because I needed everything to be exactly perfect and always looking perfect. So this intentional boundary for me has been really helpful in kind of creating a work-life balance. I found myself thinking like, yes, I had to set up particular boundary that was designed by my work in order to fix and correct that issue I'm always running into with myself. That was the one that I was like, I know I do that.
It's really insightful. I appreciate that.
And I think some of the interpersonal things I found quite funny. I was reading more about what this kind of looks like in your relationship with other people. At one point, I read something similar to, you're good at teaching people things, but you need to not expect them to change immediately. And I walked over to my husband and said, hey, you have to read this, because it's literally the constant debate we have about things. Is I'll tell somebody how to do something, and then I'll be like, complaining to him about, I don't know why they couldn't figure it out. I told them once and they should have completely changed their whole way of being. He was just laughing like, yes, you absolutely do that all the time.
Knowing that you have a history in the ministry and have spent time there, as have I can imagine that that's terribly frustrating. I preached on this last week. Why haven't you all changed your lives?
Yes. I remember many times having discussions with the church. I was like, the stained glass windows are not the answer to life's greatest questions. Can we please stop talking about it? And I could never understand that after telling them that, they hadn't totally changed their philosophy and they were still worried about the windows.
This feels a little strange to bring up out of the blue, since I've just now met you, Lindsay, but I'm really interested. You said you've taken tons of assessments and now you've kind of made the Enneagram like officially one of those. But you had an awareness of it before that, yeah?
Yeah. So I actually, first of all, I'm a huge kind of podcast junkie, right? Like I listen to them all the time. And so there are a number of podcasts I listen to with various motivational speakers or people who kind of do more in-depth conversations. And several of them, I'm thinking specifically of Rob Bell, actually, talks about the Enneagram constantly. I feel like I know the most about it from sort of overhearing other things about it, but had never really like plugged in and taken it. I'd read through like the types because, you know, as either the person being interviewed or the interviewer would say, oh, I'm a 2 or whatever. I was like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, people rely on that too much.
So I guess I kind of had read through the types. And when I had read the descriptions, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a 1. So when I took it, I was pretty not shocked. I think the like descriptors that I saw that were like next to it said something like perfectionist, really purposeful or something. And I was like, yeah, we joke all the time that I'm incapable of having any kind of even object in my house. Like if it doesn't serve a purpose, I want nothing to do with it. I cannot handle things that are frivolous. We have nothing on our walls because I don't understand art because it doesn't do anything.
Wow.
And so my husband's always teasing me about that kind of stuff. And I thought, oh, yep, this is going to be me. And I might be this to an extreme, actually.
I entered that question saying that it's kind of, I feel odd bringing it up because it's sensitive. I didn't actually get to the sensitive part yet.
Oh, okay. I'm ready.
I'm interested in the Enneagram in particular, but also other kind of personality profilings and your stance as an LGBTQ person. I think I slurred that all together and I apologize.
Oh, no.
And I don't know. This is one thing I've actually been fascinated to have a conversation about because it's something I want to learn about. Is I get the sense, but it's tough for me to tell from where I'm standing, that personality profilings tend to have kind of a cis white male hetero kind of baseline, and maybe other people don't fit into them as neatly as I do from where I'm standing. So if you're able to, I'd love for you to speak into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually on a board here called GLSEN. So it's a national board, and they work with youth who are GLBTQ plus, wherever they fall.
Mm-hmm.
I myself identify as queer. My husband is actually trans. So I say he and I say husband. We probably look like a very heteronormative couple, but we're definitely not in identity.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to him about this a little bit too. I think for me, as a person who definitely identifies as cis, even though my sexuality identifies as queer, I have not had too much difficulty because a lot of times they're written so that you could take it like it's it'll say partner or something. So for me, it's not as noticeable.
Yeah.
But for people who are somewhere outside of the cisgender, there can be a lot of difficulty because you feel a social pressure to maybe fit into certain gender stereotypes, or you've felt like, this is more masculine, and I definitely am trying to switch away from being identified as feminine, so I'm pushing myself into these traits as a way to kind of reject what society's trying to make me be. So you sort of go the other extreme. And I think as you're identifying yourself and kind of figuring out where on the gender spectrum you fall, sometimes it can be hard for you to know where your identity truly lies and where you're just trying to test it out because it's the first time you've had the opportunity to, live into a certain way of being. Certain things like, being caring or maybe people pleasing tend to be identified with femininity. So if you're somebody who's trying to, show that you are more masculine, even if those are traits you might have, your self-analysis might be like, no, I don't have those things because I need to reject that so that I can really be who I am. And, I'm sick of that being pushed on me. I feel like the difference is if you're more comfortable with where you are in your gender identity, you're probably more accurate in your answering, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
That makes it sound like it's less about any kind of inherent limitation in the systems, even though that might be there. And it's more about how all of these things rely on self-awareness. And there are a lot of ways in which we can foul up our own self-awareness.
Right.
One of those being we haven't been able to settle into an understanding of our personality, of our identity that's comfortable to us.
Yeah, and I think the same is even true for, I remember taking a psychology class in high school and looking at different answers in even like the Myers-Briggs, and thinking about, I don't know how I am, but this is what I want to be and what my peers are. So I must be this. And so I think for me, it's less that the tests are necessarily biased in any way, and more that the better you kind of understand yourself, the more you're able to answer things in a way that is going to get you the most accurate results. Because we all have a tendency to say, okay, this statement that popped up, I have to either agree or disagree with it. I really wish I was somebody who either agreed with it or disagreed with it. So I wish that so much that I will click this, even though it's maybe not how I really feel. And so for me, I think that that's probably the biggest issue with anything like this. And I think it's less inherently about the test and more just about being comfortable in your own skin being supported in a way that is going to make you know that however this turns out, it's not a negative reflection on you, and it's not necessarily a perfect reflection of you. I mean, do I really think that there are only X number of people in the whole world? No, we're all a little bit of various things in various situations at various times.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important that we sort of have the best understanding of ourselves as possible and be comfortable that, I read like, oh, perfectionists like can be over the top, really want people to change immediately. Those aren't like necessarily great characteristics, but I can say, oh yes, I see those things in myself and I see myself working on them, and kind of laugh and appreciate the way it's helped me in my life, but also recognize I need to change it a little. If I was less comfortable with myself, I might be like, well, no, I'm not like this at all. I'm much nicer and less rigid, and I certainly don't need everything to be in small boxes and organized perfectly all the time, even though I do.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you're saying that, I'm looking back to when we first started talking about, you took the test and you're a 1 and what that means to you. Even though you were talking about things that, aren't necessarily the greatest thing or the best possible thing about the 1, you sounded very comfortable with it. Even when you say, I don't like art on the walls. I get it. I don't understand what art does. And you're able to laugh about it, which shows a great level of comfort. Or I'm really terrible about not taking things home, and I'm glad that I have a place where that I can't take things home. This is good for me. I just want to mirror back to you that I'm seeing that you have that level of comfort, and I really appreciate that about you.
Why, thank you. I think it's
you're welcome.
I mean the reality is, there may be exceptions. I hate to say any, but the vast majority of personality traits, if in any extreme, can be bad, right? Like being extremely caring sounds like a great thing, but if you're so caring that you give away your entire life savings and you have no home and you're living in a cardboard box so that, someone down the street has everything that they need, that extreme is not healthy.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of times any kind of test like this highlights areas that you sort of, you just need to be aware that you don't let the pendulum swing too much, and that these may be the areas you're most likely for that to happen. So just kind of keep yourself in check. But I don't think that, even traits like selfishness on some level are good, because it means that you are going to take care of yourself. You're going to maybe make some space and some time. Other people, I know a lot of people who will say yes to 35,000 things until they basically just collapse. They could probably use a little more selfishness. So I really think that it's all about living kind of less in extremes, which, in full disclosure, I'm not great at. I'm really good at extremes. I talk a good game, but not always great at it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. There's a lot of different phrases that Enneagram people use and that kind of speak to that. The one that comes to mind is that your strength is your weakness. And just depending on the situation and where you're at with your strengths, it could be either a strength or a weakness. And especially if you're exercising what you're good at out of compulsion and you can't help but do it and you can't hold yourself back, it's a weakness. But if you're free to exercise it or not exercise it to your benefit or to someone else's benefit and in a balanced way, then it's a strength. And I think that that's one thing that the Enneagram highlights. Yeah.
Yeah, I really do think, I think that's one of the things I have liked about kind of reading the descriptors in this is it definitely shows areas where I'm like, yeah, that's a positive, but they're absolutely right. I remember doing projects in school, and things should have taken me an hour, but I would spend, 45 minutes making sure the font on slide 3 was exactly how it needed to be. And it's not like anybody that saw the presentation was like, oh, slide 3, that font, whoo, blew me away. But I can tend to get so hyper-focused on the perfectionist part.
In regards to that, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
You reminded me of a conversation I had with an Enneagram 1 not too long ago, and she had lost sleep over something really trivial. So I want to know, what's the most trivial thing that you've lost sleep over?
Oh gosh. How long is this podcast exactly? Yeah. Okay. So we'll have part 1 and part 2. All of part 2 will just be the things I've lost sleep over that are stupid. Let's see. So I just got married in September.
Okay. Congratulations.
Thank you. So we had all of our wedding party wear gray, and then they were to wear an accent color of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. So they were kind of like a little rainbow, but it was subtle. And so I wanted to make sure that we had decorations at the reception that kind of mirrored that. And I was totally beside myself worried for quite a significant amount of time, and lost much sleep over worrying that the candle holders were not going to be at the reception hall, were not going to be the same shades of these colors as the accent things that the people in the wedding were choosing. Like, what if they choose a more maroon red and I've chosen a bright red candle holder? Then they'll clash, which doesn't even make sense because it's not like the person's going to carry it around with them. There's no need for it to match. I think that's where it's been really helpful to have my husband, because he will say those things. And once I'm reassured of them, can sit back and realize how ridiculous I'm being. But it often will never occur to me on my own. But I think I do things like that fairly often. I am the type of person who will have conversations with people and then come home at night and rethink all of those conversations, all of the ways in which I should have said, oh, why did I say that? I should have said this. And why would I go in that direction? I clearly should have gone in this direction. And with the conversations I have on a regular basis at work, that can be challenging because sometimes I only, the average stay for a patient is 3 to 5 days. And they're not often responsive for all of that period of time. So if I'm second guessing the interaction, it may be the only interaction I have with them. So that in some ways can seem trivial, but can also feel really upsetting to me if I walk away from a conversation and feel like I've messed it up because it may be the only conversation.
Sure.
And I think that's been one of the harder sides of that constant worry about perfectionism is when you can't go back and fix it, or you have to sit with, oh, I missed an opportunity. And I hope that person was able to kind of come to a peace or get through the issue they were talking to me, even though maybe I didn't do the thing I wish I'd done. So that for me has been the hardest part, which kind of plays into your, have I lost any sleep over anything trivial? It's those interpersonal conversations where I have a much harder time stepping back and saying, oh no, this is so minuscule. This one little shift in conversation didn't probably make the difference between, a good death and a not good death.
Yeah.
Because you have a strong sense of how much the conversations you have with them can have an effect. And so maybe there are trivial things that can be obsessed over, but also that those conversations are significant. Otherwise, why would you be having this conversation?
Right.
I would imagine the less trivial it is, the harder it is to make peace with.
Absolutely. And I think that there are certain things that weigh heavy on me. I've always had a really hard time with the ways in which churches damage people, or ministers, preach that certain people are hated, or, inform people that God doesn't love them. These messages are messages I hear very often at the hospice from people who are very worried at end of life that they're about to die. They're about to meet a God who's hated them their whole life. What happens from here? So I think that kind of representing religion in a lot of ways to people has made me extra sensitive in that context of not wanting to be another person that does any kind of spiritual damage to them. So that I take more seriously.
Lindsay, we've talked a lot about your job situation, and I find it really fascinating. I'm interested in what strengths you feel like as a one you bring to a hospice care setting.
Yeah. So I think part of me is that I definitely have a strong sense of what I think is good and right and moral. And when I feel those things are that way, I really hold tight to them. So I feel like in some ways that's been a huge strength, because I'm willing to kind of give my all to try to help somebody find peace, because I believe that's so valuable. So I feel like when I enter a room, I'm entering, fully there and fully present and fully believing that the person in front of me is loved completely and totally despite any flaws. And I believe that so strongly that no matter what they divulge to me, I don't walk out of that room thinking, oh, well, there's a lost cause, and I think that for me has me also carry a little bit of hope, which is good for my coworkers too. Sometimes a person can be, if they have a significant trauma history, for example, they might be very demanding of the nurses or need a lot of attention, be constantly ringing a call bell and stuff. And, as a nurse, you want to provide good care to everybody and equal care. And if you have one patient that's taking up a lot of your time, I think it can start to wear on you because you worry you're not doing good enough for the other people.
Yeah.
My belief that all people are, just doing the best they can with the skills they've kind of gotten helps the staff when I can say that to them. And I can say, the only reason she's pushed the call bell 16 times, and asked for water is because she's so lonely and she doesn't know how else to get more people in there. She values you coming in to see her. And that helps shift kind of the nurses' interactions with the people. So I think those kind of values that I can kind of project to other people have been really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's probably been the biggest way I see that I've been, I guess, helpful.
You mentioned the strong sense of what ought to be.
Yeah.
And you could call that a lot of things. Sometimes justice is a good word for that, but maybe order is a good word for that, or even just basic respect could be a way to say that. But you've always been, like, since I've known you, you have maybe the strongest convictions of about anyone I know, and that's one of the things that makes you interesting. And also because you're so kind and personable and gentle, even in the midst of those convictions. That's just not something I run into much. So that's one of the things that I've always appreciated about you. But then when you said that you're a one, I thought, well, I mean, of course, Lindsay is a one, but also you just come off a little different than a lot of ones I know.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I wonder if it has to do with what things are held in high value.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because it seems like, and obviously you guys know way more about this than I do, but it seems like it's really important to ones that the things that they value are held above all other things. And if perhaps, one person's highest value is all people are good and deserve, to be heard, they might respond differently than if somebody else's value is we need to fight for the underdog, which are, both beautiful things, but one implies more putting the other person in front of you, and one implies more holding the other person's hand as you go forward. And so you'd see different traits, even though it might be coming from the same place, or different behaviors, rather.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really insightful.
Thank you.
So what would you say for you then? You've sort of given it away to a degree, and maybe this is putting you on the spot some, but what would you say that those primary values would be for you, the things that shouldn't be compromised?
I think probably for me, the one thing I can say when you say that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the idea that all people are loved. I believe very strongly in one God, the Christian God. And I, obviously am very much in line with that way of thinking, but I believe that nobody has lived a life where they have swayed so far that they're not loved. And it is my belief that we should try to live into loving them the way God loves us. And so no matter what somebody has done or where they have been in their life, I always resort back to, where are the places where I see good, I see beautiful things? How can I look at even the things they're doing that are terrible and understand that they're coming from, survival skills or environment or, some perhaps cognitive struggle, but that it's not them being a morally terrible person as much as evolving from this yucky, traumatic thing that happened to them. Mm. These coping behaviors that perhaps aren't great, but really trying to see people's humanity and loving them as best I can as beings who are created by God.
Lindsay, I want to point out that the stereotype of ones is that they're very black and white and that they don't see the gray. And, like something is either perfect or it's not perfect, and that they really struggle to understand grace. And in what you're saying, I'm hearing so much grace. It's really beautiful that as you're seeing others, like you have so much grace for them. But at the same time, you're looking for opportunities to help them live into that grace and become that better version of themselves, or the better version of whatever the situation is. And as a one, this is just you're a beautiful breaking of the stereotype. I'm loving it.
Well, it's funny you should say that because I'm incredibly black and white in that I absolutely 100% believe that everybody is redeemable and is covered by grace and is loved completely. And there is no exception to that rule.
Yeah.
I'm like a hopeful black and white person, right? I'm an optimist in how I see it.
Yeah, but you found the thing to be black and white on that allows you to be graceful to others. Instead of just being black and white all over them, you're black and white on this one issue that brings them hope, and it's great.
It can get me in a little bit of trouble though with the more pessimistic world, where I'm like, no, I know they did this terrible thing, but they are good people, obviously.
Fuck the pessimists. Who cares?
As you're talking about your conviction about accepting and loving people regardless of everything, of choosing to interpret situations in the most generous way possible, understanding that so much of our situations are contextual or out of our control, or are actually examples of resilience that are still being labeled as immoral behavior or whatever. As you're talking about all of that, some of the things that came to mind were conversations we've had where you're frustrated with people or irritated with people, and your way of seeing the world, of seeing people in that light particularly, does cause a lot of tension between you and other people. Frequently, at least in the conversations we've had, part of what frustrates you most is when people don't seem able or willing to see other people the way you see them. When other people don't extend that grace.
Yes.
That seems to be exasperating for you.
Yes, and I think that so I worked for a long time in child protective work, and it was kind of this unspoken rule that I always got the most challenging kids, because I fundamentally just believed that if we all poured as much love into them, that they would do better than where they were. and that better than where they were was better for them. It would help them get further, but it didn't have to be perfect. But I was always willing to keep pouring that in. And, there were always other people that I worked with who were like, this kid is so hard. I feel like I'm beating my head against a wall. Like, they aren't changing. I've tried 65 interventions. I don't know how to help them. Or, same with the birth parents. Like, how many conversations can you have about this is something you need to do to get your children back, and then say, oh, they used again, or whatever the thing is, and just not feel frustrated. And I was always sort of known as the person who would say, right, they used again, but they did that because they're highly stressed. This is the coping skill that has helped with that stress. It may not be the best coping skill in the world, but it helped with the stress. So you add on more stress of, them losing their kid. Of course, they're going to default to the coping skill they've known. And in a lot of ways, I became sort of the birth parent advocate. Even when I had to tell them hard news, they would hear it coming from, I get it. I get this is your pattern. I get that you're trying the best you can, but this is still not an acceptable behavior. And I used to get teased a lot that if there was a hard conversation, they'd call me in, because whether it was the kid or the birth parents, I was always able to say, I see where you're coming from. It's not good. You can't do that, but I get it. And so I think it was hard for me to sometimes have conversations with my coworkers who would feel like they were banging their head against the wall. And I would be like, well, of course we're banging our head against the wall. That's not our life. That's not how we were taught to handle stress. So that's not going to be our issue. If it was our issue, we probably wouldn't be working here. But I do think it can make it hard for me to work with coworkers who aren't necessarily as willing to buy into the everybody's redeemable model, just because I want everybody to see all of humanity is good. And that we all do bad things, and some things are bad enough that we need to set up some very serious boundaries, but it doesn't mean that the person is all bad.
I'm hearing your pastor illustration earlier where I told them everybody is inherently good, and why didn't they just change their mind about it? I've told them once.
Yes. That's exactly how I feel like a lot of my conversations, I think I can be so grounded in what I think is true.
Yeah.
That it can be challenging for me to see why other people aren't seeing that as true, because it's completely fact. So why wouldn't they just see it?
Yeah. It's so apparent to you. Why isn't it apparent to them?
Yes. Yeah. And I think in a lot of my social justice work stuff, that I tend to see that trend too. I remember when the whole gay marriage debate was kind of going on here, I was like, it's two consenting adults. Even if you don't think it's okay, what do you care? It doesn't affect your marriage. And it was so clear to me, I just could not wrap my head around why anybody would ever be standing on the other side, because I felt like I had assessed their position. And my stance was, if you don't want a gay marriage, just don't get one. It seems easy enough. I could understand why they couldn't get it.
I didn't want one, and I didn't get one.
Yeah.
It was pretty simple.
Yeah, see? I mean, I feel like it was so clear to me, which I think probably is why debates are not great for me. Because I have a really hard time like stepping back and assessing where the person is coming from once I've decided what their opinion should be. And it doesn't go anywhere, right? Like if I'm fundamentally rooted in the idea that my way is the right way, I'm never going to be able to find that gray where we can shake hands and walk away. I'm going to sit there and lecture you on how I'm right until you fall asleep. So
there's no agree to disagree.
Right.
I'm right, and I'm going to bend you to my way no matter what it takes.
Right. Yeah. And like that agree to disagree thing doesn't make any sense to me at all. I'm like, no, because there's clearly a right answer. So why are we agreeing to disagree? You should just realize I'm right so you can move forward in your life.
I am so curious about that clarity, though, because there are many ways in which you just have that clarity, and it almost seems innate in a way, like you just see a situation this way, and that has to be how it is. And from my experience with you, you're pretty good at those things. Like, you don't tend to be wrong in what you see
well, Steven,
as obviously
have you been listening?
case,
I'm never wrong. That's my whole point.
Well, yeah. But I'm curious, not even about whether the way you're seeing is right or wrong, but where does that come from? Because, so as a non-one type person, I don't necessarily understand on the inside quite how a one works. I've talked with a lot of ones and I've read a lot about it, and I understand, okay, like, there's this conviction that comes from the gut that doesn't even necessarily have to be examined very well. It doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in anything particular. Not that you don't do that after the fact, but that it's not necessary. There's this gut level conviction, and it just comes from where? What is that like? Because I don't
you answer
experience
that,
anything like that.
I know that Steve and I have both expressed as fives that debating ones, like in a situation that you were just kind of talking about, can be really frustrating because fives spend a lot of time developing their convictions and crafting them, and it's for fives it's almost a labor of love.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a one show up and go, you're wrong, and it's just because. It can be really frustrating. And so I'm really interested to know where it does come from, like Steve is too. So,
well, the sarcastic, sort of irreverent part of me wants to say, like, I think it's just divine intervention, and God just gives me these answers. But in more seriousness, I think some of it is very much just part of my DNA in whatever that means. I remember being a young child, and I was always in trouble at daycare for like arguing with kids on the playground because you're supposed to count to 50 and then the person is supposed to get off the swing, and that is the rule. And I counted to 50 and the person kept swinging, and that is unacceptable. So I think there's a piece of me that just sees right and wrong as extremely important. So I think part of it is that. And I think the other part is maybe a little environmental. If I was going to guess, I would say my mother is absolutely a one. I've not had her take this, but I am my mother. And I think that seeing her very confidently take stances on things and how people really respected that about her and often, wanted her to be on boards and on committees and stuff, as well as my dad, because they both were so sure of themselves that I think that I kept seeing that as being reinforced as such a positive. And so when something comes up and I don't feel like I know the right answer or whatever it is, I learn and read and try to grab as much information as I possibly can. And then once I've settled on my answer, that's my answer. And I can say it strongly enough that, I want the other person to believe what I believe, but I am positive I will not walk away from the conversation believing what they believe. The more important thing. I guess agree to disagree for me means more like you can keep believing the wrong thing, is more my assessment of that.
Lindsay, I'm interested to know, are there situations where all of a sudden you realize, oh, I don't know what's right or wrong here, and then you feel like, I need to figure it out?
Yes, absolutely. So I don't know how familiar you are with the current stuff going on in the Methodist Church right now, but there's a big potential split. Yeah. And there's the group that's we want to allow clergy who are gay to be ordained and to continue on in the process. And, if God calls them, then we should support that. And then there's the group that's like, no, gay people should never be leaders in churches. We'll let them in, but they need to not be in charge with that lifestyle. And then you have like another group who's saying like, oh, we just want everyone to love each other all the time, which to me is a non-stance. So the very last church I served was kind of split. And when I started there, They knew nothing about my identity at all. And I keep my personal life out of my professional life. That's how that works for me.
Yeah.
So it had never come up until I started doing protests at conference, in which case now when you Google my name, it's like Lindsay Flick, gay pastor, which is terrific, as if that's my only identity in the world. So the church found out and became pretty upset and, wanted to have a lot of interventions and talks about if it was appropriate for me to stay there. And I really struggled with what the right thing to do was, because one part of me wanted to say, as a person who is called by God, I have the right to serve as a pastor in this church, and I have a right to be here and to be in leadership, and I've been doing good work, and they have loved me up until this point for all the work I'm doing, and so I need to stick my foot down and say, nope, this shouldn't make a difference. And then the other part of me is saying, if I'm causing struggle or turmoil or upheaval in a church, does it matter what the issue is? Or as a good leader, do I need to say it's more important that the institution is held together than it is that I stand up for this particular belief system? Maybe I'm just not the leader they need, even if I don't fundamentally believe that they have the right to ask me to leave. Do I need to take a higher road and walk away?
Yeah. I
really wrestled with that because I feel like I've been somebody who advocates for a long, long time. So for me to look at it as, is advocating going to do more damage and this community is doing such good work for this area, where's the right thing to do? And so I think that there are issues like that come up for me where, I fundamentally believe that it's good to do as much giving in a community as you can, which this church was really doing. And it's also right for me to stand up and say, I deserve to be able to pastor a church and to not have that called into question just because of who I date. And so it was like a conflict between two things I hold to be true. And that's, for me, I think where I see a real struggle, where it becomes really challenging for me because suddenly I'm arguing with myself between two things that are absolutely 100% true and couldn't be wrong ever, except that one of them has to sort of weigh more than the other. So I think that is a struggle for me when those types of situations come up.
Yeah, that sounds like one definition of pure hell to me.
Yes.
Yeah. Can I ask, how do you choose between two 100% certainties?
I think for me, a lot of it is looking at what is the greatest good. In that particular situation, it was, okay, what is this community providing to people? What good are they doing together? If I leave, how much good will keep happening? If I stay, how much damage and how much of that good will be taken away? And then assessing the same thing about me personally and realizing, me sticking my foot down and saying, no, I'm going to stay is less about the greater good of the community and more about me saying, I'm a whole person and I deserve to be treated as such. But is that why I got into ministry? Was it to be recognized as a whole person, or was it to do the greatest good for the community? And it has nothing to do with me. So ultimately, I said, my belief is that the community is the most important. And at the end of the day, walking away from the church, I was still able to say, God loves me. This just isn't the right fit. And I think that's how I kind of assess all of those situations is I look at what kind of detriment will come out of each solution and what kind of good will come out of each solution. And I do tend to lean towards whatever does the greatest good for the most number of people. Yeah.
So another thing they say about ones is that they can be depended upon to exhibit really high moral integrity. And I think that story is just a perfect example of that. I mean, the way you're willing to set yourself aside for the greater good of the community, like you said. So, yeah, thank you for that story.
Yeah.
No question. Just that comment.
You're welcome. You're welcome. for my mental health, I need to not be as involved in the news, which I always feel terrible about, because I say, what a place of privilege for me to be able to say, I can check out, I can check back in. And then I start to, go on that guilt trip and try to check back in. And then I find I'm just a terribly angry human being when I watch too much news, so that I check out again.
One of the things I hear from ones all the time is people always say I'm not so hard on them. I'm way harder on myself.
Yeah, actually, so I guess on a personal note, I am definitely extremely hard on myself. And one of the things that's always been hard for me in relationship with a partner is they see how hard I am on myself and preemptively assume I'm that hard on them, which I think a lot of people who are very close to me interpret that I'm going to be hypercritical of them because I'm so hypercritical of myself. And I end up in a lot of conversations with people who get into my inner circle about, I recognize that I just talked for 45 minutes about how I got an A- instead of an A on this paper, but I'm not disappointed in your B at all, because I have high standards, but I have perfect standards for myself. And I just have expectations that other people will do their best for them. But it's hard to, I think, for somebody who doesn't have that maybe constant internal criticism going, to not assume that it's projected in both directions. And it's hard for me to understand why they would assume that, because I truthfully don't feel that way. So it doesn't occur to me until they bring it up that would be, of course, the logical conclusion. And so I think that, it's funny. I just heard you say, talk a little bit about internal criticism and dialogue and what that's like. And I think, oh my gosh, what would that be like if I didn't have that? Oh, wow. That would be so lovely if I didn't spend, 35 minutes every morning being like, oh, I'm going to be late because I just reassessed, 12 times how I did X, Y, or Z wrong or not right, or why didn't I, I'm constantly feel like I'm running late to things because I'm trying so hard to get as many things into a morning as I can because I want to waste no minutes. And so just that kind of like, oh, what would it be like if I was like, I don't actually, the laundry will still be dry when I get home. It doesn't actually have to be folded and put away before I can leave for work. Or I'll think about it all day long and, oh, why didn't I get out of bed earlier to make sure that was done? Oh, that would be quite a relief. I would think I would enjoy that. How do I become something other than a 1 for a while?
Oh, well, that's actually a really important question, because in the Enneagram, there's a whole discussion about how we live into the other possibilities. Part of what makes the Enneagram distinct in comparison to other ways of looking at personality is the Enneagram assumes that personality is actually kind of a problem. It's your dysfunction. It's like an artificial self-limiting. And so ideally you get freed up so that you can engage whatever energy you need to. Mm-hmm. So yeah, part of the whole purpose of Enneagram is to learn how to not be your number, at least to a certain degree, right? Like how can you get some relief from that kind of dysfunction?
Yeah, I wish I could just hang out with a 9 and I'll become a 9 for a little bit or whatever.
Just take naps and watch Netflix all day?
Yeah, I want to be a 1 Monday through Friday and a 9 on Saturday and Sunday.
I like it.
Well, I mean, I don't know if we haven't talked about whether you feel like you have more of a 9-wing or a 2-wing. Let me turn that into a question before I keep talking. Do you have any sense of whether you have more of a 9-wing or a 2-wing? Are you familiar with wings?
No. Just probably you should start there.
You have most likely developed one wing or the other, and it'll always be one of your neighbors. So for you, either a 9 or a 2. And you're going to have some amount of either 9 energy or 2 energy influencing your 1 energy. And I've heard you say you've read some of the profiles. Off the top of your head, do you remember if you resonated more with a 9 or a 2?
Definitely a 2. I would say probably. So the reason I just use 9 as an example is because it's probably the one I at least see myself in. The kind
really?
of, yeah, it sort of came off as like easygoing, agreeable. I don't know. They seemed more like I'm okay with things as they come to me, and I'm always searching for like, this is good, but how could it be better? Yeah. Complacency is like the opposite of me 100%. So the reason I just said, maybe it could be a 9 on weekends is because that was the one that most stood out to me as like, yeah, I'm not that. A 2 was more like the generous kind of like serving type personalities, right? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. And so I definitely see that in the kinds of work that you've chosen: social work, pastoral work, hospice work. I mean, you're definitely a 1, but there's kind of like a draw to the helping professions where a 2 would also thrive, Yeah. My guess would be a 2. But the thing about wings is if you only have 1, you're not going to do much. Part of the growth available to us is to kind of live into that other side and further balance out our personality by learning how to be more like you're a 1 with a 2 wing, but you can develop and strengthen that 9 wing. You have that energy available to you. It's a resource for you. You've just kind of forgotten about this resource that you have. And so you can build that. Something to think about for the future. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's the kind of thing that you can definitely make progress on with intentionality.
But at the very least, not at all a surprise that you'd be drawn to the 9, because there's a sense in which 9 energy would be a good balance.
Yeah.
That's how the wings tend to work.
Right.
Yeah, you actually spoke about it as something to balance you out. That's a great point, Steve.
Yeah, and I think I did something when I was reading it, and I could be way off, so please feel free to correct me, but I think I read something about that they really have a quest for like internal and external peace for kind of themselves and others. And I think that that's something that I definitely seek, but I struggle with my rigidity around those things. I have a picture in my head of what perfect peace would look like, and I have a projection in my head of what it would look like if I had that peace and if other people had that peace. And so then I get so rigid in my framework that I like can't. And then it's like, if I meditate every day, I would have perfect peace, but I missed one meditation in the past 30 days. So great, way to go.
Yeah.
It's like I feel like I have the longings of a 9, but the like 1 traits in a lot of ways create roadblocks to me feeling like I live into fixing those longings, if that kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first things that for anyone to really make progress after self-awareness is learning how to be non-judgmental and make non-judgmental observation, especially about themselves. So like for me as a 5, when I see myself doing something really super 5-y, instead of being like, oh, God damn it, I'm doing that 5 thing again. the key is to do it non-judgmentally. Just notice it and be like, oh, I did that again, and notice it and then just let it pass, right?
Right.
That's super hard for 1s because that judgment happens so quick and it's so reflexive. Even just catching yourself making a judgment, and then now you're going to judge yourself on catching yourself making a judgment, and now you just judged yourself
right
on that.
Yes.
And there's almost like an extra step each time for 1s, where I caught myself doing that one thing where I was extra harsh criticizing someone when I really didn't need to be, and now I'm going to judge myself on doing that, and now I need to like make an extra move to not judge myself on judging myself on doing that, right? So it is kind of like extra hard for 1s to live into that step, but that is, like you've already kind of named it, that is the step of just learning to see things in a non-judgmental way, just to see them.
And I think truly it's this idea as much as I don't want to be somebody who thinks that there are, perfect steps and perfect paths and perfect ways to do things, that I am much more likely to see that other people can have multiple paths and not allow myself that same kind of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have a coworker who meditation has been something we discuss a fair amount at my work, because it's it can be a high stress environment. So finding ways in which we can sort of not have those stresses is really important.
Yeah.
I have a coworker who's saying, oh, I've gotten this meditation app and I'm doing a really good job kind of buckling down and meditating, and I meditate 3 times a week. And I was legitimately praising her and excited that she was doing that. And then I was thinking in my own head, like, oh, if I meditated 3 times a week, I'd be furious at myself for the other 4 days. Like, oh, you didn't even do a majority.
Yeah. It's interesting the way you're talking about this. There's a reputation that ones have for when they go on vacation. They plan the whole thing, like every single rest stop, every single bathroom break, everything is planned out ahead of time. And then you have to achieve that plan, right? I feel like that's the way you're talking about the spiritual journey. I've planned out my spiritual journey.
Right.
And now it needs to go according to plan. And I think spiritual journeys don't work that way, right?
Right. Yes, yeah. And I think for me, that's probably one of the reasons that ministry and working in this kind of work is so wonderful, because I like to be really good at things, but as soon as I'm really good at them, I find them very boring. So I need to constantly be engaged in things that are always pushing and challenging me, because as soon as I'm bored, I'm done with it. So I think for me, having kind of this profession that's constantly challenging me and saying, like, you may have thought there was only one way for this to happen, or you may have thought this was going to be the conclusion because your Excel spreadsheet with the 16 steps led you to that. But that's not the way it worked, and that's not the way it's going to work. And next time, everything can look exactly the same and the conclusion can be different. It's really just always keeping me on my toes.
Yeah, there's a built-in messiness.
Exactly. And I need the built-in messiness, because I won't plan for it and I won't allow it if I can help it. So it needs to happen to push me and challenge me.
That's some wisdom.
And you're absolutely right about trips. We were talking about honeymoons, and my husband said, we should go somewhere on a beach and just relax. And then he looked at me and said, no, that's never going to work for you. We should go somewhere where I can go to a beach and relax, and you can go to 55 different museums and attractions, and then we can just have dinner at night.
Yeah. Relaxation. What a terrible waste of time.
Yes. We actually went on a family vacation with his family, and we went to the beach, and I was reading nonfiction books about how to do better chaplaincy work sitting on a beach in front of the ocean, because I didn't want to waste the time. And people were like, you could relax. And I'm like, I am. I'm not moving. I couldn't understand how that wasn't reasonable for other people.
Yeah, I almost feel like 75% of the actions that ones take is just guilt management, just staving off the guilt for the next half hour or hour or however long. Just if I do this, I won't feel guilty.
Yeah. I think I'm probably really bad at relaxation. And the one way I've sort of gotten myself to accept that that's something I need is by justifying the research that says you're more productive if you have built-in relaxation, which I think is humorous, because I'm actually trying to build in relaxation to further improve my productivity, which so it's not relaxation for relaxation's sake. It's relaxation to be better some other time.
Yeah.
think that it's true, though. I mean, I definitely in my life hold myself to standards that are pretty unreachable, but don't necessarily see the same behaviors as shortcomings in other people. I just see it as like, well, of course they went to bed early. They were up late last night. Whereas for me, it's like, how could I go to bed early? There were things to do. Actually, it's funny. Pregnancy has been a real struggle for me because the first trimester, you're exhausted all the time. I'm somebody who likes to overfunction constantly, and being tired hinders that. People keep asking, like, oh, is the morning sickness bad? Is the whatever bad? Well, no, the fatigue is stopping me from doing all the things that I'm supposed to do. And I'm really bad at allowing that kind of realistic space for myself. Whereas, I have two best friends who are almost the same amount of pregnant as I am. And they're like, oh, I went to bed at 7. I was like, of course you did. You're growing a human. Like, it's so reasonable. Right. It's so reasonable for me to like hand them like, well, like this is totally reasonable behavior. And I'm fundamentally completely sure that that's true. And yet I have a different complete truth for myself that I hold myself to, which is interesting because when I like dissect it, I think, well, that doesn't make any sense. How can it be an absolute truth if it's not true in all situations?
Yeah, we've run into that a lot so far where you go, well, for this person, there's this standard, but for me, it's this, a much higher standard. Have you put much thought into like how you could live into like that grace that you show for other people?
I think I'm hoping that at some point in my life, I'll be better at initiating it internally. But I think for me, the thing that's most helpful right now is having people in my life who I trust, who can kind of shed that realistic light for me.
Mm-hmm.
Steven's a great example. When I'm absolutely beside myself, furious at something I've done or whatever, I can call him and he can just, with one simple question, be like, well, if so-and-so was doing this, what would you think? Or, and I'm, oh, yes, I see where there's a breakdown here. But I almost need that external kind of initiation to almost give myself permission because I am bad at failure, and anything short of perfection is failure for me. So, which is a hard standard to try to live to. Impossible.
Most would say impossible.
Yeah. Notice I even say hard. Like, it's like some level of me does not even comprehend that that's like...
It's impossible.
Not realistic, yeah.
You seem to be struggling with that word, Lindsay.
Leave me alone. I'm just the one. I can't help it. I think that having people in my life who can say impossible helps me sort of to check in that kind of more real way. So my husband is pretty much polar opposite in a lot of ways, and he is very good at just relaxing and kind of taking breaks when he needs it and being very aware that he needs to step back from things sometimes and take a breather. Whereas I will push and push and push and push and push until I can't even get out of bed because I'm so exhausted. And so I think having somebody who can say, did you notice how I said I was tired and I took a nap and that was great? And you said you were tired and then you did 9 more hours worth of work? Mm-hmm. It can sometimes be like, because I don't really make the comparison without being prompted.
Yeah.
And I think the comparison is helpful for me because it's a concrete example of, do you see how you have 2 different standards? That's not working. Mm-hmm. Which goes back to my black and white thinking. Both things can't be true. So if it's okay for them, I need to allow it to be okay for me.
Yeah, I actually really like the way you're being a one and you're flipping it on its head. You're using its own momentum against it. If I'm really black and white, then the standard needs to apply to me too, or however you want to say it. But yeah, I like that.
And I think that for me right now, is very helpful. And I would say that there were times in my life where even somebody else saying it, I would come up with 20,000 reasons why they were wrong. Well, the situation's different for me because blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've gotten older and started to realize how detrimental that kind of thinking and that kind of expectation on myself can be, I haven't quite been able to master seeing it myself, but I can get there much faster once somebody prompts me.
Mm-hmm. There's probably also quite a bit of arrogance in that kind of reasoning, don't you think? Maybe I'm wrong. I find that typically whenever someone holds themselves to a higher standard and they can come up with a million reasons why the situation is different for them, most of the time there's a lot of pride behind those reasons.
Yeah. And I think that that's something I try to sort of lean into too, is this idea that if I really believe that, we're all valuable and good and have gifts and have areas that we struggle with, that I have to believe that I also have gifts and areas I struggle with. So it's okay to admit that, and that that's part of the human condition, and it's okay. And that if I'm going to say that I am the exception to that belief, then am I placing myself in a higher plane? And that's completely unacceptable to me. So I do need to take a step back and say, all right, I need to work on this area. I think that was one of the things when I was really reading about a one and the areas that one struggle. I felt like I could have written that myself because I assess the areas I struggle and accept that I have things I don't do well, but at the same time, still expect myself to do them perfectly, even though I know I don't do them well, which is kind of this weird catch that I get stuck in. Like, why can't I do this perfectly? I'm not really good at this, but why am I not perfect at it? And so kind of bringing myself down to the reality of, because we all have things that we're not great at, and there are areas where I can really learn from other people. And these are areas where I can really learn from other people's strengths. So how can I do that better? I'm trying to kind of keep myself in check.
It really is an illustration of how our strengths and weaknesses are so intimately related to each other, right? You do have such high standards for yourself, and that can become problematic, and you have to find ways to balance it and stay healthy. But also, you're one of the most driven and productive people I know, and you do a tremendous amount of good in the world because of it. In a similar vein, and kind of the opposite direction, you're able to see so much grace. You're able to see the good in people and embrace that. And even though you have a hard time doing that for yourself, you do have this skill that you can use, and you have to find a way to make it useful for yourself. So you find tricks like other people or whatever, but the strength that you already have provides a good balance for the weakness.
And I think that probably is true for most people, right? I think sometimes our positives really are the things that help us with maybe our shortcomings, but also, our shortcomings can further fuel our other shortcomings. And sort of, it's all just tied into humanity, and we're all trying to do the best we can with what we've got, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's a hot mess.
Lindsay, I have a question that I'm hoping won't send you into existential crisis on our podcast.
Oh no.
In the past few answers you've spoken,
yes,
or alluded to the fact that you're pregnant. I'm wondering if you've put any thought at all into being a one and motherhood.
Yeah. So I'm 14 weeks pregnant, which means that being a person who really, really likes plans, I put a lot of thought into motherhood.
Have you planned out your whole pregnancy yet?
Pretty much. So the joke from my friends was I posted on my Facebook, due date is July 12th. So that something like, we'll see our sweet baby on July 12th, blah, blah. Something which I considered totally benign. And my best friend commented, I think it's cute that you think the due date is like a deadline.
Yeah. Like, we don't have the baby before now. We're running late. We fail.
Right. She's like, I can see you waking up on the morning of July 12th with your suitcase and just going to the doctors, even if you aren't having contractions, because you'll be like, no, today is the day. You told me. I think that it's been interesting. So we were looking at baby stuff, and I said, well, of course we'll use cloth diapers. And my mother said, why on earth would you ever do that? and I said, well, environmentally, it's absolutely horrible for the earth, and I don't want to contribute to that problem. And, financially, it's a terrible decision to purchase disposable diapers because they're far more expensive. You're better off to make the initial investment. And, you can find, and I'm like naming the types and the research I've done. And my mother's just sitting there staring at me like, we're talking about something that's going to hold poop. And my stance on it is so cemented and firm. And so well, obviously this is the right way to do this.
You're going to have poop all over your hands so often.
It has made me think about other ways in which motherhood is going to be a challenge for me, because I like plans. I like things to go as I have planned them. And rumor has it that that's not exactly how children work. I think that my husband is much more adaptable. If we have a plan and we're supposed to leave at 10 and we're supposed to go to here and then here and then here, and one of those places is closed, it takes me an hour before I can get over the fact that the plan was destroyed. And I think, when you have a kid and you wake up and the kid is sick, and my plan was to get up, dress the kid, take the kid to daycare, go to work, and I have to change that. I'm not going to have an hour to just sit there and grumble about it. I need to move on. And so I think in a lot of ways it'll push me to kind of grow in those areas where I struggle, to learn to be a little less rigid in my planning, to be more adaptable. So I see that as being a good thing for me, but also definitely an area I'm going to really struggle.
Yeah, this is a growth opportunity.
Yeah. And one that it will be interesting, because there's the component of I am much more likely to push myself if it's for the good of someone else that I love. So I can see myself being much more motivated to grow in those areas because I love this child, as opposed to I should just be a better person. Which never tends to be quite enough to push me. So yeah. I think that that's been interesting. And even pregnancy itself has been kind of interesting. I'm so practical about things sometimes that I had a person at work come over and say to me oh, I just loved being pregnant. It was such a beautiful experience. And I was like, you wake up and you feel like you're going to vomit. You can't stop falling asleep. None of your clothes fit, so you have to buy a new wardrobe that you can only wear for 9 months. What part of this was beautiful? I just couldn't, I get so kind of, I'm like, this is I want to have a child. I want to be a mom. That's beautiful. But this baby growing part is sort of the route to get to that part. And she was much more no, in this space, in this moment. And I'm so no. This is step A to a 2-step process. And so I think that even just this pregnancy has made me slow down, be in the moment, say, okay, I had a plan today. That plan's not quite going as it should. I don't feel the best. I need to figure out how to work with this and get as much done as I can, but not overexhaust myself, because there's another being relying on me.
Yeah.
So I think it's good. I think that it's helped me see my faults almost as, instead of practicality, as a little bit as selfishness, which is something I don't want to be, which motivates me very strongly to reassess and come to a different conclusion.
I'm curious, the one thing that you didn't really mention in all of that is, what about the standards you set for yourself as a parent? Is that going to open another door for you to be really hard on yourself?
I think that the saving grace in this is that I worked for so long with kids with special needs that there is a component where my idea of the ideal child or the ideal behaviors or, the ideal expectations is so skewed because I'm so used to seeing such incredible positives in things other parents would see as not necessarily huge. Like the fact that a child walked to me was, sometimes miraculous, even if it was at 3 years old. Whereas for other people, they'd be like, oh, my kid took 1 day over 1 year. Like, that's ridiculous. So I think that because my idea of child development and what being a successful child and doing a good job in parenting is so, I've seen so many different examples that are not the norm, that I think that's actually going to help me a lot. Because if the bar for a lot of my parents was, you kept the kid in a warm house, you fed them 3 times a day, you got them the proper medical care, you're being successful. If that was the bar, then it allows me to sort of see this bar for myself a little bit better than it would if I maybe was walking into first time parenthood as somebody who expected that, my kid was going to speak 6 languages by 7 years old. I just am like, oh, good, the kid's talking. That's wonderful.
Lindsay, what I like about that answer is this. Even before you're a mother, you're already extending yourself, or at least in theory, you're extending yourself the grace that you've extended to other families and other children, which is what we've talked about like over and over again in this podcast episode is like, how do you extend yourself that grace? It's unreasonable not to. And I love that this is the instance where it seems like that is maybe actually happening, which is really, really kind of cool.
I wonder if it's easier for me in some ways because it involves another human.
Yeah.
Maybe that's where you'll learn to do it when it doesn't involve another human. This is where it starts.
Yeah, because when it's me and just a goal, it's almost like my brain won't allow for other factors. And so it's all my fault. Whereas if it's me and another human, there are 10,000 other factors. And so I allow myself more flexibility in that, or more ability to not hold myself to a ridiculous standard.
Yeah.
See, I'm rationalizing why I should allow myself grace there and not in other places. Yeah.
Well, it starts somewhere, though. And so I wanted to highlight it because I think we're already seeing it start somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think with a little bit of intentionality.
Do you pay for like follow-up therapy after this, now that you've made me, have an existential crisis and all this?
No, I think you should be paying us. I think we've opened up several layers of insight into what's going on with you, Lindsay. I think that
terrific.
You should be thanking us.
I'll send you my insurance information.
Okay.
We do have this thought that we might like to follow up with guests after a few months and just see where things gone since the conversation. Just like short little follow-ups. We haven't really done that yet, but that's a little luxury fantasy that we're affording ourselves. So who knows?
We're trying not to be too hard on ourselves that we haven't done it yet.
Yeah. Maybe that'll be follow-up therapy. After all of this conversation, threads that were introduced and maybe dropped, and we were kind of all over the place. Is there anything that you would like to add or address or just comment on that we didn't really have space for, or we just moved right on past?
I guess the only thing that kind of comes up is that because I tend to think in extremes, I worry sometimes that when I talk about having strong convictions that I can sort of come off as somebody who thinks they're better than other people because I've got these strong convictions. And as I was like kind of processing when I was talking about, I was thinking like, oh, I mentioned like I do social justice work and I'm a chaplain in a hospice and I'm a mom and I expect lots of good things and I've worked with a lot of children. And I was like, oh my gosh, like It sounds like I'm this egotistical, crazy person. And I just wanted to say that I hope that, I'm sort of processing through where I see these things in my life, but I definitely am very sure that there are, times where I get things very wrong and totally mess things up, and I'm not good all the time.
I have never heard a one say that. Never. Actually, that's really a common thought for a one, that they're not good all the time. Anyway, sorry.
I'll definitely make sure in the editing that you don't come across so good.
Good, yeah. Just add in periodically, like, whoa, like you or Seth saying, like, oh gosh, I can't believe you would say that, or like, yeah, just,
Hey, Lindsay, thanks so much for coming on to our podcast. I know Steve and I both really appreciate it, and I think we've had some really wonderful conversations, so just thank you.
Thank you guys so much for having me come on, and I enjoyed chatting with you and learning more and reflecting more. It's been wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks.
Good. I'm glad. See, there you go, showing grace for someone else.
Shoot, I was supposed to sound like a not good person. Oh.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of E9. You can follow us on Twitter at E9 Podcast. I'm at skeptical_monk, and Seth is at Seth Harshman.